In which case, everybody, it's now 2 o'clock Thursday afternoon. So welcome to this meeting of the Audit and Accounts Committee of Cambridgeshire County Council. I'd like to begin by welcoming both committee members and those members of the public and press who have joined us today for this Audit and Accounts Committee meeting at New Shire Hall, where I extend a special welcome to Councillor Philippa Slatter, attending her first meeting. So please, ladies and gentlemen, treat her and the rest of the committee gently. Don't use any gobbledygook or convoluted acronyms when plain speaking is the order of the day this afternoon in particular. I'd also like to thank Councillor Simone Taylor for all her work on this committee since 2021. The County Council allows filming and photography at its public meetings, so please feel free to take pictures and use social media during the meeting. Can I ask, though, that everyone present turns their mobile phones to silent or vibrate whilst the meeting is taking place? Please be aware that this meeting is being live streamed and that a recording of the meeting will be available to view on the County Council's website. There's no fire alarm test scheduled for today, so if the alarm sounds, please leave by the nearest marked fire exit, which is through the middle doors on my left, and assemble in the car park. Dawn, do we have any apologies?
We have apologies from Councillors Maguire and Whelan.
We don't have any substitutes, but we are still quorate, so I propose that we continue the meeting as normal. Does any member wish to declare any disclosable pecuniary interest or non-statutory disclosable interest?
I believe, Chair, that there may be mention very shortly in this meeting of FACT, which is a charity which I am appointed to as a trustee by the County Council, but being so appointed means that I'm potentially conflicted, so I won't say anything as and when that subject is raised.
Thanks, Chris. No others? No, we've received no petitions or public questions. We are being asked in item 3 to approve the minutes of the last meeting on the 24th of November 2022 as an accurate record. If any member wants to raise a question on the accuracy of the minutes only, can they do so now? I see no objections, so we'll take that as carried unanimously. On that basis, are committee members happy to approve the minutes as written, subject to that change? Again, I would ask anyone who objects to raise their hand now. No. Okay, on that basis, the recommendation to approve the minutes is carried. We move on to the updated action log, which was also included in the public papers for this meeting. Are there any updates on this or questions, or can we take it as noted?
Just to add that in relation to item 104, a briefing note was circulated to committee members on Tuesday.
Correct, and that relates to FACT and has some very helpful information in it. It is marked confidential, so we won't discuss it today. But what I would like to do is to discuss things that can be discussed either in public, or if necessary, move to a private session in a future meeting. Let me pass over to Tom or Stephen for comment on that.
Yes, Chair, very happy we can pick that up either after today's meeting or in a future meeting, having it on the agenda.
Okay, thank you very much. So we'll take the action log as noted, and I believe, did I hear a ping that Scott is now online? So members, with your agreement, I would like to take item 6 before item 5, as we have Scott Knight of BDO available via Zoom to join us. Are you happy we make this change to the order? Thank you. So I'll pass over to Tom first and then invite Scott to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. So just to set this in context for committee, this dealing first of all with the objections, which is why BDO have attended today. So just taking the committee to page 29 of the reports and 2.2, that sets out the current position on the objections. As a reminder, local electors are able to raise an objection to the accounts, asking for an item either to be declared, an account declared as unlawful, or raising matters that maybe require a report in the public interest. The council currently has 2 objections outstanding with BDO from 2017 and 2018, and then 4 objections relating to the subsequent years that are with EY, which we may come back to later in the item. But the committee will recall that you heard from Lisa Blake at BDO last May on the progress with the objections, and subsequent to that, there's been further follow-up with BDO, and indeed Stephen Moyer and I met with Scott earlier in January to hear the latest position, and Scott has kindly agreed to come to the meeting today to relay that directly to the committee.
Thanks, Tom.
Welcome to the committee. I hope you can see and hear us. A few things which we would like to hear from you. Firstly, confirmation of what work you think is outstanding. Secondly, whether there is anything that you still need from the county council, or whether you're comfortable that everything is in your hands. And the third, obviously most important thing from our point of view, is when will this work be completed? So over to you.
Thank you. So I was contacted by Tom and Stephen with some frustration at the pace at which this matter has proceeded. I agreed to look into the matter, and I interviewed the relevant individuals. And it's fair to say it's taken far longer than it should have done, and that we have not delivered on this in a timely way, and we've not kept to the client service levels that we should have done. And I have apologized to Tom and Stephen and said that it's not the type of execution that we should be delivering, and it doesn't meet our standards. It's been impacted by a leave of absence for quite a serious illness for one of the key individuals, and that person's now returned on a graduated basis, and I've made it a priority of that individual to clear this. As of today, we have drafted the response, and it's with the lawyers for legal review. After that, it goes to the PSAA for their review. It's difficult to precisely say when it will be complete, but we are in that completion phase, and I'd expect it to be a matter of weeks now. It's embarrassing how long it's dragged on, and I think we would like to draw a line behind it as quickly as possible. There's nothing that I'm aware of that we are waiting for from the council. It's now in the hands of the various legal reviews.
Thanks, Scott. And just to clarify, the legal reviews is simply to review the work that has already been done, so there's no additional work to be done. And how long typically do the PSAA take to review all of this?
Well, we will ask them to turn it around as quickly as they can, given the backlog, and I think they've indicated that they would do so. So I think we're talking about the matter of a few weeks rather than anything longer than that.
Okay, thanks, Scott. Let me pass to the Chief Executive and then to one of the members of the committee who's got a query.
Thank you, Chair. Not a huge contribution. I just wanted to remark on the referral to PSAA and Scott's comments. It was just to say that we have corresponded separately with PSAA, as members of the committee may be aware from the papers. They have expressed their equal frustration around this matter, so I'm hoping on that basis they understand the need to expedite matters when it reaches the PSAA. But of course, at the moment, as Scott has indicated, matters still remain with BDO and their legal advisors. So I just thought it would be helpful for members and for the purposes of public viewing of the committee to be clear that PSAA are aware of our frustrations and have responded to those as well separately. Thank you, Chair.
Thanks, Stephen. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. I think it's appropriate to just express some gratitude to Mr. Knight as the head of audit and assurance of BDO, that he has taken responsibility for this particular item and has investigated it, and he has given us an acknowledgement that the delays have been greater than they should have been. And I'm grateful to Mr. Knight for, first of all, taking this on, and secondly, for that acknowledgement, which I think is a professional thing to do.
Thank you.
Well, thank you, Scott. I have written down a matter of weeks as how long you think it will take to be delivered to us. I'm certainly hoping that it will only be a matter of weeks and not a matter of months or years as we've had so far. All right, if there's nothing from anybody else, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, Scott, and we look forward to seeing the final results when they come through. Thank you. You're welcome to stay or go as you see fit. I'm sure you've got other things that you would like to be doing.
Thank you.
So if we can move on then to Stephen and then to Mark on progress with the various external audits. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair. Yep. So Tom Kelly's introduced some of this report in respect of previous financial years, but the report itself, the main body of it does touch predominantly on the audit of 21-22's accounts and financial statements. So introducing this item alongside me, I'll just make you all aware of Ellie Todd here, who manages our corporate finance team as well, who obviously do most of the detailed work on this. So the audit on 21-22's accounts is nearing completion, but is still ongoing at this stage, but is so far progressed that we feel able to bring an updated draft set of accounts to you today, which is probably the bulk of your papers, but is provided. We provided the paper about a week ago with the information as it stood at that point in time. The audit is obviously a fast-moving process, so we've provided an annex to that report with some up-to-date information, and also alongside that now has been published a provisional audit results report from EY, the external auditors, which our annex sort of provides a bit of commentary on as well. So we say in the annex that we provided that we would invite the committee to consider a delegation at this stage to delegate to the chair and the section 1151 officer to sign the accounts. So I'll come back to that at the end of my introduction. But just before that, to provide some assurance to committee over sort of where the audit is at this stage. So as I say, it's nearing completion. The vast majority of requests have been dealt with, and we're responding to the sort of the last few queries from EY. We are anticipating at this stage an unqualified audit opinion at the end of the process, and that is reflected in the provisional audit results report. The results report makes some recommendations around sort of the internal control environment, etc., some helpful recommendations, which in the annex from us we provide some initial management responses to, and we'll obviously consider them in more detail in due course. The outstanding areas in the audit are generally of quite a technical nature, and are set out in the report as well, that the outstanding areas have reduced somewhat since then. The outstanding areas do in some cases require us to be liaising with third parties, such as the council's valuers and this land. The results from the report so far, from the audit so far, have generally been good. There are several adjustments to be made, as there usually are, to the accounts as the audit has progressed. Where those adjustments touch on the key financial statements, they've been set out in the report. They don't suggest to me any particular weaknesses. They are in many cases often due to timing and information being available. The results report does flag up one further area of potential adjustment around the valuation of the solar asset, which we're considering is quite a technical area of evaluation, but if an adjustment is needed, it will be quite a discrete adjustment in the context of the wider accounts. There is, I think, a few unadjusted items reported in the report as well. So where EY has identified an adjustment may be required, we as management have exercised discretion where we have it not to do so, and the rationale for that is set out in the report and in line with the principles that I think we discussed a bit at length at the last committee as well. I'll just bring before I conclude, three areas that the committee might be particularly interested in. Firstly, our payroll service, which is managed by West Northamptonshire Council. In responding to queries and samples in this audit, that service has generally been quite timely, though some of the queries backwards and forwards of the UI are still outstanding, but generally an improved performance there. Secondly, on infrastructure assets, the national issue that is stymied local government audit recently, that area is still somewhat outstanding with EY in terms of final queries. There has been a statutory override, however, to the SIPFA code to deal with the national issues in accounting for infrastructure assets, and we're just working with EY to provide assurance over the final set of balances there and comply with the code as it now stands following the statutory override. And then thirdly, finally on valuations, and just to say that we're working with the external valuers NDY to progress queries, and we do have some ongoing frustrations with timeliness and the need to quality assure those, but to provide some further assurance to committee, the valuers are having to deal with quite a lot of work in respect of the 22-23 year end at the same time as answering queries relating to 21-22. So finally, wrapping up then, given hopefully that assurance to committee about the state of the progress of the audit, I would suggest an officer alteration to the recommendation, Chair, with your agreement, with committee's agreement, which I'll read out if helpful. I think it's been circulated, but for the benefit of anybody watching, it's just to add to, as well as noting and commenting on the report, to add recommendation B to receive the external auditor's provisional results report, and C to delegate authority to the Section 1.1 officer and the chair in consultation with the vice chair and lead members to sign the final statement of accounts and to make any related declarations and representations taking account of the final audit results report to be received from the external auditor, and agreed adjustments contingent on receiving an unqualified financial statements opinion. And then finally, in conclusion, Jay, just to give my thanks to the hardworking members of the finance team that have enabled us to get here today, particularly Ellie and the small number of dedicated close down accountants that we've got. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. And again, let me reinforce those thanks, Ellie, to you and the team for all the hard work that you've done in responding to the comments that have come from Mark and colleagues and doing the accounts. I've got a series of questions, but Chris, did you want to comment on the recommendation as well as other raised?
On the recommendation as amended, I'm perfectly happy to agree to that, Chair. I've got quite a few comments as well. I'm happy for you to make yours first if you wish.
Do we let Mark comment first, and then we'll raise general questions? So, Mark, do you want to also introduce your colleague to those?
I will indeed. Thank you. So to my right is Jacob McHugh, the manager for the engagement. So along to provide support and to provide an update on some of the areas in our report where we said we'd give a verbal update today. So I'll build on what Stephen has said and talk about the accounts, but happy to come back to our element of the outstanding objections at the end, just to close the circle for you. So I think the detailed papers that officers have prepared and Stephen has presented today portray the current position. The audit has and is going well, but members do clearly need to be aware and acknowledge that the set of accounts before them today is indeed complex, and ensuring all the audit risks are appropriately addressed is our key consideration. But good progress has been made, and as you can see, with relatively low level of audit differences found, both corrected and uncorrected, which are set out on pages 8 and section 4 of our report. Those are and should be remembered to be set against our materiality level, which is 19.7 million. So we currently have corrected differences of 5 million cumulatively, with unadjusted differences of 6 million cumulatively across a handful of areas. Whilst we are pleased with progress and the support provided, there are clearly some key areas yet to conclude in the audit, specifically around long-term debtors and the recoverability of this land group loan, the conclusion of our property, plant and equipment valuation work, and the conclusion of our work in relation to COVID-19 grants and the accounting for that. As Stephen said, the statutory instrument and code adaptation for infrastructure assets should resolve the issue we had last year, but we would still need to go through our own processes to remove last year's limitation of scope and the potential impact it would have on this audit report. Therefore, we will need to complete all of those procedures, and then we will issue a full and final audit results report, as Stephen alluded to. We have identified those 6 control observations on page 11 and section 7 with recommendations against each, and we have noted management's response today to those, which seems to be going in the right direction. If you wanted an update against each of the areas where we said we would give you a verbal update, then I can hand to Jacob. But if you are managing time, Chair, then I am in your hands.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Let's deal with questions of things which you have written about, and then potentially we'll come back to outstanding work as well. So I've got a few questions. I couldn't see direct reference to the various objections that have been made by local resident, and I would have expected something specific on that. There is something general in Stephen's covering report. Secondly, Scott talked about legal review. So could you just clarify how within EY you deal with that, or are you responsible for producing this report and then EY takes it as that's it? So I guess those are sort of my 2 main ones, and then we can come back. The third thing probably is the value for money work, in that you say you've started it, but I would particularly like to know how that is progressing. Shall we deal with those 3 first, and then I'll invite Chris and Nick to ask other questions.
Certainly. So on page 10 of our report, we have a section on objections where we note we have received 1 objection in relation to the 2021-22 statement of accounts, and we are assessing that alongside those in respect of 18-19, 19-20 and 2021. So it is there, albeit at the bottom of the page, Graham.
Yeah, I haven't got that, Mark, but it doesn't specifically. It says we have been able to conclude that the objection raised does not have an impact on our ability to issue our opinion on the statement of accounts, implying, if I've got it right, that you don't believe that the issues raised in the objection are valid. But maybe that's going too far.
That would be an incorrect conclusion, I'm afraid, to draw.
Okay,
because our opinion is to give a true and fair opinion on the financial statement. That does not necessarily mean that we are rejecting an objection on the grounds with which it has been submitted, because that can relate to governance related matters or unlawful items of accounts, which could well be presented in the accounts in a true and fair way.
Right. So just following that for my benefit, but also for Philippa's benefit, you might find from an accounting point of view that the accounts are fine and the elements related in the objection to the accounts have been correctly sorted, but there are other things within the objection which we shouldn't assume are covered by your audit, and we would need to investigate those separately. Is that what you're saying?
Indeed. So if we retract or go back a little bit, an objection to the accounts can ask an auditor to deem that an item of account is unlawful, which may impact the true and fair opinion, and or issue a public interest report in relation to governance arrangements or other dealings at the council, or indeed issue statutory recommendations. So all of those are an ask of the auditor. We then have to decide whether they would have an impact on a set of financial statements and a true and fair audit opinion that we would give over those. So there is so you can have issues that don't impact the financial statements, which we still have to opine upon, and we could agree with an objector about, and we could still issue a public interest report over. We're saying here that we don't believe that our ability to give a true and fair opinion on the 2021-22 accounts is impacted by the current objection.
Right. I think that's helpful. Philippa, help me out here.
I was hoping it's going to be the other way around, actually. Reading this, and I've only recently, and it is in English, I know, but it's so mysterious. You know, an objection. We have I have no idea from this. It may have been in previous discussions. I don't know what the nature of the objection is. And my only point of reference is the pension fund, where you have categories of objections or categories of failures even. We don't ask who and exactly what, but I would like to know what's the nature of this, because this is a sort of thing, it can blow up in the face of a councillor.
Indeed it could. And I think what Mark is telling us is that we cannot be assured by his report that everything raised by the objector is sorted out one way or t'other, and that there might be more work that we as the audit committee or officers need to do on that. But is that
it's also fair to say that the objector has very helpfully circulated the entire membership of the council with a very detailed account of the objection. So if you were to go through your past emails, you will find this this document.
So it's obviously not a secret, and perhaps councillors could furnish me with that reference. Thank you.
I will do that for you, just to remind you. Okay, thank you. The other couple of points, sorry, Mark, about value for money and legal, in quotes, sign off. Can you just cover those?
Of course. So if I go to the objections first, so we have agreed a timeline with which we will conclude whether we are accepting and then determining the objections in relation to each of the 4 financial years that we quote, with an end timeline of the 23rd of February this year of sending our statement of reasons to the objector and to the council. Those do require a review internally, clearly, which would include a level and layer of legal review because of the nature and content of them. And we are required to run our statement of reasons through public sector audit appointments, as Scott alluded to, so they can address their own legal processes. And we have submitted ours to PSA today. So that is the timeline through to when we would issue our statement of reasons. In terms of value for money, again, we have outstanding value for money conclusions or arrangements work in relation to each of those 4 financial years. We have commenced work on them, but in discussing with Tom, we would need to spend a period of time after the objections are concluded to run through all of them and then issue all of our conclusions or updates to our audit opinion in relation to them in one go. So you'd almost get 4 on the same day in relation to each of the years as appropriate. And we would need to sit down with both Stephen and Tom and work out the timetable to get through that after we have concluded both the objections and our opinion on the financial statements.
Okay, thank you. Chris and then Nick.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. A few points, but first of all, just to take up the point that Philippa was raising earlier, which is a very valid point. I just wonder if it puts Philippa's mind and the members of the general public's concerns somewhat to rest, to point out that with this statement within the draft accounts, EY are telling us provisionally that they don't see that this matter is any hindrance to them providing an unqualified audit report. And maybe that might be a helpful thing to say in the context of what we are talking about here. I've had a lifetime, Chair, of being either on EY's side of the table or Stephen's side of the table in in auditing sets of accounts and dealing with financial year's end. And lots of things can go wrong. Sometimes circumstances are bad, but sometimes you have problems because what you do need to have is two things that are absolutely essential to the equation. In fact, three. The first is having a well-prepared set of financial statements produced by the accounts in the first place by Stephen's side. And the second is having an audit which goes through smoothly and successfully and is well planned. And the third is making sure there is good cooperation between the two sides. And I have to say, on the basis of what I see in front of us here and what I've heard, I think we've succeeded in all three cases, and we need to give credit not merely to our auditors, but also to Stephen and his team for the work which has been done. I saw nothing which is particularly urgent in the items, whether there were matters which are to be brought to our attention. I didn't see anything particularly urgent in that, so I think it's appropriate for us to wait until the audit is completed and we can get a full list of those matters, and then we can consider them all at once, rather than trying to pick off one or two at the moment, because I just don't see any of them as being really time sensitive. I think I would be grateful, however, Chair, if we could, a note could be taken, and if it could be agreed that when we do receive the final accounts and they are reported to this committee, if we could also be given a list of the unadjusted differences which emerge from the audit. Now, they don't need to be adjusted by their very nature, but nevertheless, I think it's often very interesting to the committee, both to see what they are and sometimes to get an explanation about why they haven't been adjusted, which tends to be because they're immaterial. But nevertheless, I think it can be quite interesting to see that information if it could be provided to us. Now, heaven help us from government attempts to make accounts, especially local government accounts, simpler. But every now and again, the government decides they'll try and make accounts better and simpler and easier to understand. And the most recent significant change that government has made to make accounts easier for people to understand was the introduction of the narrative report. Now, we have in front of us a narrative report which is 27 pages long, which I think will be just as impenetrable as the other 280 odd pages that we find there, or less than that, 260 odd pages we find there. I personally think that the narrative report, which itself has to be audited, it all has to be checked and cross-checked against the figures. I think that it does not achieve the objective of making the whole set of accounts easier to understand. What I've done in Finland, and what's been done elsewhere where I've been a member, is to say in future that it makes sense both from the point of view of the amount of work that officers have to do and the intelligibility of the narrative report for the outside reader, and for the amount of work which needs to be done by the auditors and by our financial staff, if a narrative report could be condensed to no more than 12 pages. It can be done. We've done it in Finland, and I would just ask that the administration, together with the senior officers, just have a conversation about this for next year, not for this year, obviously, but for next year, just to give consideration as to whether it may be in all our interests, including those who are meant to be reading this and potentially who are lay people and who will not have the attention span to go through 27 pages, whether it might be more helpful to have something slightly more pithy, which might be only a dozen pages long. On the subject of the statutory override on asset value, my understanding is that what we've got here is a delay in the implementation of these rules rather than a reversal of them. And I must admit, I've got to the stage of being confused because I initially saw the reversal when it was done in Scotland rather than in England. And I now might have got confused between the two sets of rules. But my understanding was that maybe it's for effectively three financial years that the delay is taking place. I could have got that wrong, and if so, I'm sure someone will correct me. But my concern is just this. We can't just sweep this under the carpet and forget about it. I think it's really important that we be prepared for when this or something very similar to it does come into force, so that we don't suddenly find ourselves scrambling when the new regulations do finally come in to try and deal with a situation which will, on the basis of what we've seen so far, not necessarily be a very easy situation to be dealt with. So I think those are the points I'd like to make. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Chris. Stephen or Tom, do you want to comment on, or even Mark, do you want to comment on some of those?
I can provide a brief response to Councillor Bowden on a couple of them. So in terms of providing to the committee a list of the unadjusted differences at the end of this process, I think I committed at the last meeting to provide that when we are done. So I think we'll come back with if the accounts get signed under a delegation, then we will, when the committee next meets, we'll provide an update which will include that. Again, without getting into too much discussion potentially on the narrative report, because we did discuss this last time, I think as well, or when we brought the last set of accounts, that The narrative report is lengthy. It probably is a bit too lengthy. We'll definitely review it when we're doing the next set of accounts. It is a requirement of the code to set out the activities of the organisation in the narrative report, and we are quite a complicated organisation at the end of the day. But I do agree that we probably could do it in a slightly more pithy ways, as you say.
Then the final point about the implementation of the new rates and Scotland and the confusion about when and where.
So I'm not sure at the top of my head how long the override is in place for. Council Board may have slightly better recollection than me, but the issue is at the end, well, you know, if the override disappears and we're back to the code as it was, then there is always going to be a bit of an information gap in those earlier years. And to provide some assurance, the information gap in Cambridgeshire was, in my view, quite a lot lower and further back than in a lot of councils. But without a substantial amount of work to fill that information gap, we will be in the same position again.
Thank you. Nick.
Yeah, just regarding the recoverability of the loans to this land, which after all are fairly substantial at £113 million. Could you give us a little bit more detail about the methodology that is going to be used for this, and the degree to which the outcomes will be robust and the level of assurance that they will provide us going forward?
Certainly. So at the moment, we're waiting for management's assessment of the recoverability, and clearly that assessment will include their level of judgment and potentially estimation about whether the full balance or an impaired amount of that balance would be recoverable, which we would then test the basis of those judgments, the reasonableness, the sensitivity of them, and therefore whether the carrying value at the 31st of March is appropriate, given what this Land Limited's business forecast, cash flow forecasts, and indeed the business environment within which they are operating all predict. So it's challenged to management on their assessment. So I think the question, unfortunately, maybe Tom or Stevens about what goes into their judgment. We would then check that judgment.
Yeah, and so just to add to that, Chair, I would say from my perspective, the council's made quite significant, and this land have made quite significant progress in the last 12 to 18 months in terms of the transparency of their financial information, the governance, their risk management, and their financial projections do foresee a better position. But as part of that transparency, we have taken Strategy and Resources Committee through the additional through the sensitivities that the company is exposed to, and we're seeing that now with some of the movement in house prices in terms of a short-term effect. I'm conscious it's a long-term business plan and the commercial risk aspect as well. So this is a kind of an additional risk for this audit in terms of looking at the this land recoverability through the IFRS lens of credit loss. But beneath that, we think there is the underlying substance is a strengthened position for this land, certainly from where it was 12-18 months ago. So
would you say that the current levels of inflation are actually beneficial for this particular issue then? There's very few benefits to it, but this might be one case where the debt is being dissolved somewhat. Yes,
different levels of inflation are one of the sensitivities we worked through with this land, and what is very apparent is that it's those long-term averages over the next 8 to 10 years, which is where we're quite focused rather than the kind of short-term effects. I think Councillor Kay is right to draw attention to inflation in terms of the overall materiality of the loans, and the economic conditions have different impacts on this land. So, for instance, they have fixed rate loans from the council, which isn't probably an advantage in the current context. But they are also exposed to construction price inflation and changes in the housing market conditions and house values as well. So those components are regularly considered by the company and factored into their forward projections and forecasts, and will support the assessment that we provide to EY.
Okay, thank you very much. Any other comments from anybody? I've just got one other. You refer, Mark, to various recommendations for, I guess, further work on pages 41 and 42 of your report. Looking at Stephen or Tom, are you comfortable with these? Do they all make sense? Are you going to be implementing them either as part of this audit or subsequently?
Thanks, Chair. It's probably worth referring to our responses, our initial responses to those recommendations at 2.2.2 of the annex that we provided after the publication of the main report. So responses of varying degrees of certainty about what our actions will be.
Sorry, Stephen, I've missed that. I'll have to go back and find the relevant page. 2.2. Yeah. So so your initial conclusions about some of these recommendations about the minimum revenue provision for solar farm valuations and so on, are there any that you're not comfortable with? So, for example, the last one about the SIPFA disclosure checklist sounds to me, and I'm not an expert, as quite an important topic. And it says we will consider undertaking this further exercise for completeness for the 2022-23 accounts, rather than doing anything retrospectively for these accounts.
Yeah, so the key thing with that one particularly is to note that we believe that we are covering all of the aspects of that disclosure checklist through other processes. It's not necessarily in one sort of neat SIPFA branded way, but we are providing all the necessary assurances, and we'll look whether we can roll that all into this specific disclosure checklist for future audits. But it wouldn't be any different work per se, just work done in a slightly different way.
Okay, thank you very much. Anything final comments from anybody? Philippa?
I would just comment that if members of the committee are meant to understand the narrative report, brevity does not necessarily improve comprehension, and sometimes a very densely packed sort of academic style where they've shaved off all the words that are useful wouldn't necessarily help. But I'm quite happy to be a guinea pig, and I'll read Councillor Bowden's version as well, and maybe I can help make progress in because I do agree it needs to be an informed member of the public, rather as well as a committee member, that needs to understand and be happy with our narratives.
Yes, I agree, and I have some sympathies with both arguments. I think the annual governance statement, as written at the moment, is quite complex and detailed, and maybe it doesn't need to be quite so detailed. But Chris,
yes, thank you. I don't disagree with any comment that has just been made by Philippa, but this was meant to be simplification. That was the word which was used by government when they introduced the concept of a narrative report. It's resulted in more work, more time, longer reports, and it's ended up with reports which are, I think, longer than was ever expected by government, where they were expecting a really brief outline which people could read within a normal attention span that a person who wasn't dedicated to local government could manage to give to it. And I have to say, in my opinion, 27 pages is significantly longer than that achieves. And I do believe that length is actually important here. The longer something is, the less likely someone is even to start it.
We will leave that one floating. Excellent, thank you very much. Bearing in mind Stephen's comments and Chris's support for this, the committee is asked to A, note and comment on the report, which we've done, B, to receive the external auditor's provisional results report, which we have done and asked questions about, and C, this is the new bit, to delegate authority to the Section 151 officer and the chair, in consultation with the vice chair and Councillor Bowden as the lead opposition member, to sign the final statement of accounts and to make any related declarations and representations, taking into account of the final audit results report to be received from the external auditor and agreed adjustments, contingent on receiving an unqualified financial statements opinion. Are we all comfortable with that? Yep. Are you comfortable with that, Mark? And when will we receive your final report so that we can do all this work? And don't say a matter of weeks.
We are working with officers to get to that position by the end of March.
Okay. Yes, 2023, Philippa adds. Wonderful. Okay, that will be good. Thank you very much. We will be ready to review and to sign. Thank you. Right, let's move on then to item 5. Thank you, Stephen and Ellie. Item 5 is the debt management update. And can I ask Alison Balcom, Head of Finance Operations, to introduce this report? Alison, it's getting a bit dark up your end. I don't know whether you can.
Yeah, I was a little worried what happened.
So when you're ready, Alison.
Thank you, Chair. This report provides an update from last year's audit committee that was presented in July 22. Before we go into the report, you'll notice, those of you who read last year's report, there's a slight change to the report. We've put a graph in there. I think it's really important to measure the level of debt versus the revenue raised, particularly as debt is increasing over the years. So as a highlight, the current debt position is 23.3 million, which is a 1.6 million reduction this time last year, despite an increase of £8 million of revenue raised. Dean's going to go into the detail in a second. Once Dean has presented the data, we're going to go back to the service improvement plan that we alluded to in the last few audit reports. So Dean, if I can hand over to you in terms of the debt detail.
Thank you, Alison. Okay, so in 2.1 of our report, we obviously detail, as Alison has there, the current debt position, which was 23.3 million, which is down 1.6 million from the same time last year. It also represents 9.49% of the total revenue raised through billing within the last 12 months. This time last year, it would represented 11.63% of the total revenue billed. So that's an improvement in recovery rate, as well as taking into consideration the 8 million additional revenue that's being raised through billing. Just moving on to give you a bit more summary as regards to some of the key movements. The main key movement is around the NHS debt, which has reduced 3.8 million from this time last year. That's from joint work that's been done by our finance team, as well as Cambridgeshire and Peterborough Integrated Care Board, which has dramatically reduced NHS debts that the council currently has outstanding. Perversely, obviously, adult social care has increased by 3.1 million from this time last year. The bulk of that, in fact, all of that increase is in relation to the court protection and appointee process, where we're experiencing much longer timelines at the moment to resolve those. I think we mentioned it at the last committee as well, that those timelines were increasing. As you can see from the table just below, that obviously this time last year, it represented 4.9 million, where now it currently represents almost 8.1 million of outstanding debt within those categories. On a positive note, we have noticed recently through our client funds team that speed rate on the resolution of those has improved. So hopefully by the time we come back to committee next, we would hope to see that debt within that period, or sorry, those categories reducing dramatically. Before I move on, I just wonder if there's any questions around that first part at all.
Chris, you've got questions, and then I've got some more other questions probably for later on, but go on.
I've got more for later on as well, but as far as this part is concerned, I'm grateful for the analysis just given. I think it would be, given the overall report that we've got in front of us, I think it would be unnecessarily pernickety to start pulling it apart. I've got some more general points to make for the future. But so far as people's services, adult social care is concerned, the debt has gone from 12 months ago being just over half of the total debt to now being just over 2/3 of the total debt. So that there are various reasons behind that, I fully accept. What I would ask is, I don't expect next year is going to be enormously easier than this year, at least so far as the ability of people to pay is concerned. So my request is that when we next get a report along these lines, that we get more granularity just on adult social care, so that we can see just what the greater detail is of the by far the most significant element of the debt that we have in front of us. Thank you, Chair.
Can I just reinforce that? So Stephen's going to respond.
Actually, Chair, Councillor Bowden's very helpfully raised a point I raised earlier this week with the corporate leadership team. It's a question I was asking of finance colleagues. I think it would be helpful if we had that deeper dive information here at committee as well. I've commissioned something similar for CLT and was particularly interested in the profile of debt, especially aged debt over 90 days in this category. Thank you, Chair.
Alan, thank you. Yeah, that's very helpful. Alan.
Thank you, Graham. Chris has touched on a lot of what I was going to say around adult social care, so I won't sort of labour that point. I just wanted to mention, I mean, I remember last year we were concerned about the NHS debt, so I'm going to say well done to getting that. There must have been a lot of hard work done to actually get that reduced. I remember the issues being discussed last year, so that was good. And again, as being said, the deeper dive into adult social care, I think would be good. The other thing I just wanted to mention was and I presume it's the demographic we're dealing with, is the percentage of invoices printed and posted rather than the use of email addresses, which must make it much more difficult from a collection point of view. So, and obviously something I'm sure you're working on to reduce, but it must make the job much more difficult.
Dean, do you want to cover that and then move on to your other bits?
Yeah, sure. Obviously, we do provide much granularity detail as regards to adult social care within our debt pack. I'm more than happy to bring that back to committee at the next meeting to go into a lot more detail around adult social care, the age profile of their debts, as well as the categories they're under as regards to debt status as well. So we capture all that and we'll come back to the audit committee at the next meeting.
That would be helpful. I wouldn't offer us the whole of the debt because we'll just get buried. But if you can do the deep dive into the adult social care element, that would be very helpful.
Yeah. And quite right as regards to the print and the email situation, obviously we are working very hard to obviously move those customers over where we can to electronic communications, because obviously it saves the council money at the same time and it provides an enhanced service to some of those customers. Obviously a lot of our client base, and Alison will come on to probably in more detail later, is obviously adult social care. So some of that is a gradual move towards moving them over to electronic means. However, we do appreciate that nowadays a lot of adult social care debt is managed by family members. So therefore, in a lot of cases, it should be a slightly smooth move over towards electronic billing. But yes, we'll definitely move on to that. Just to go into a bit more detail as well around place and sustainability. Obviously, place and sustainability also looks like it's gone up dramatically over the year. However, when we actually did a deeper dive into the information, 1.5 million of that 1.6 million had only recently been billed and only recently fallen due at the end of that reporting period. Those monies have since come in, so therefore that position was an inflated position at that point, which has since dropped back down, just to give you some reassurance around place and sustainability. Just quickly moving on to collection rates under section 2.3, just like to draw your attention to obviously 2021-2022 has been quite a strong year with 90% of all revenue being secured based on what had been raised within that year. And to date for this year, over the first 6 months of the year, we've seen 94% collection rate. Obviously, those rates will increase as the months go on, because sometimes there are some cases that are quite complex and have to go through some quite detailed query management or dispute resolution. But those figures are quite high at the moment, which is quite promising. And that's also showing through in the figures overall. And then just finally, before obviously we go back to any further questions, the amount written off by the council over the last 12 months has also remained quite low. and it's just 0.41% of revenue raised, which is quite an impressive low amount. And I appreciate it's still 642,000 in total, but against revenue of 157.6 million is quite a low value that's been adjusted off through write-offs.
Okay, thank you very much. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, two elements from that. The first is, although it does go back to paragraph 2.1 on the table we've got there. When looking at the overdue numbers, and this is a point I raised last year at the same time, we do have just over 1.5 million, which is unapplied. Now, we don't know what that unapplied money is. If all of that unapplied money was less than 30 days old, I 100% understand what the administrative problem is with that, and I haven't got any problem at all with it. If much of that unapplied was 6 months old or more, I'd be worried about it. Now, I personally think that this is something which, if the Chief Executive hasn't already asked for information on, he certainly should ask for, because this is a management issue more than ours. But I hope not to ask the same question next year, or if we do have something like this next year, that we're given slightly more information so that it's not necessary to ask the question. I'm not asking for an answer straight away. I haven't given any notice about it, but it is something which is worrying enough, I think, for some questions to be asked internally, quite apart from by this committee. The second point is to do with what are described as write-offs, and I'm assuming they're provisions rather than write-offs. And I think that on the number, because I must admit I'm generally happy with the report that we've got in front of us. So I was looking, rather than trying to pick holes in this report, to think how could we get any further useful information beyond what we've got in this report in future. And what would be useful is to have some idea of the profile of the various debts in terms of just how old they are. Now, I'm not really that worried if it's 1 month, 3 months, maybe even 6 months old. But once you get to 9 months, 12 months and beyond, there are other issues which are potentially involved there. And that also then feeds in to the amount of provision that we've made for doubtful debts, and what our policy is about providing for doubtful debts, and then what our policy is for writing those off as to us for providing for them, whether we have any round sum provisions which are made, whether all our provisions are made specifically to individual debts. I think that's the sort of information which could be quite useful to us in a year's time when we next get this report. And I'm not asking for detail now, of course. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, thanks, Chris. Dina, I don't know whether you can address those. I think the unapplied is income, isn't it, rather than debt, because it's negative.
Yeah, the unapplied is income that hasn't been allocated to a specific invoice. Therefore, we don't know what directorate it sits under. It could sit under, for example, Audit social care. It could sit under place and economy. So that's why it's unallocated. But you're quite right. We can provide a bit more detail around that on an age profile perspective, because most of that is current, but some of it is slightly older based on where sometimes we have customers that pay us by standing order, for example. And although we tried to go back to them to say, why you're still paying us by standing order, those monies still keep coming in. So therefore, some of it is us dealing with that aspect, but most of it is current and unapplied. As regards to the write-offs, I'm not directly involved in the bad debt provisioning itself, but obviously there will be a provision that's set by the council and by the finance team as regards to the debt status, the type of the client and the age of the debt. But I haven't got any more detail than that, I'm afraid.
Does that sort of cover? Oh, sorry, go on, Tom.
But although Dean isn't directly involved, he's pretty much accurately described the process. So the write-offs number in the report is the actual write-offs, and then I think that's a useful steer from Councillor Bowden to include some more information on ageing and the policy around provisioning. That I think it's only very exceptionally we would provision against an individual debt. We, as Dean has said, refer to the category of debt and the ageing and then follow the policy to come to an overall debt provision that's acceptable to external audit.
Thank you. I'll be very happy for this to come back next year. I don't need to go into detail now, other than to say from an accounts perspective, although it may not be material, provision should come normally before a write-off. And very often you wouldn't want necessarily to write off a debt just because you provided for it, because it is still potentially recoverable, or some of it may be recoverable. So there is a difference between providing for a debt and writing it off. And that sort of thing will be very interesting to see when it can be provided by officers, maybe in a year's time.
Very simple question to do with invoices on paper. Does the council still accept cheques? Thinking of the age of the debtor as much as the age of the debt.
Yes, we do.
So family can intervene and sort it out.
Yes.
I'm afraid it's
yeah.
a question, just sign
Yes.
here, mum, sort of thing. But yeah, so we do accept.
Yes, we do. Yeah.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from anybody? No. So thank you very much. The recommendation is to note the actions and approach being taken. Sorry, beg your pardon. Listen.
I thought I'd just sort of update you on the service improvement plan. If you recall, when we took over the management of the debt team 2 years ago, we found a number of challenges. So we implemented a 26-point improvement plan. We've delivered 13 of those improvements. I think the most significant is the statement style reminders. If you recall, statements were sent out at invoice level, so the customer wouldn't know the balance of their account. It's taken over a year to implement. We've had some technical challenges, but we went live on the 28th of October. We saw a 10% increase in customers paying within that first month, and an extra 267k of revenue. Also, the feedback has been really, really positive from the customer base in terms of they actually know what they owe. So I think that's been quite a transformation for us, and it's gone really well. So we'll continue to drive that. What we did, we went live in 2 phases. Phase 1 was just those with current billing, and we're now tackling the aged debt for those that haven't got current billing. We're doing that on a phase process because a lot of queries come out from that, whether about care, etc. So we're having to refer back to adult social care. So that's been successful. That only went live with adult social care, but later in the year, we'll start to move that into all the other sundry debts. So that's been successful. The next one, which we talked about earlier, is the continued drive to reduce invoices via post. So we've further reduced we went from 76.79% when we baselined in November 21, and now we're sitting at 67.93. As you can see, most of those paper invoices go out to adult social care. So we're working with our colleagues there to further reduce that. The next improvement, we've implemented at the end of last year, working closely with our colleagues, a debt improvement plan, particularly on adult social care. So we had an initial workshop to understand the themes and sort of problem areas, and we've turned that into 4 work streams, which is the customer journey, the process, training requirements, and technology. We've got initial workshop on the 22nd of February with key stakeholders, so hopefully then we can map out the end-to-end process and understand those pinch points. I think something that was really important that came out was there's so many different touch points on the journey from care to debt that the dialogue used between teams differs, which can then confuse the customer base. So we're working with our learning development colleagues to sort of customize our language so it's consistent for the customer. So that's moving forward now. The next one, we've had an optimization of our system just to make sure we're using it to its best effect. We commissioned Unit 4 back in November last year. We've got a report which we're going through with our business systems colleagues to prioritise any quick wins and further developments. Also, from a technology perspective, we're implementing a new income management system. That's across all the partners within the lead authority model. Milton Keynes went live in December. We're going live in March. We're currently testing the solution with various stakeholders within the council. Liam, my colleague, is heavily involved in the testing. We're hoping that brings some improvements for the customers and ourselves in terms of efficiency. And then another item that with the cost of living crisis, some of the calls we're taking are increasingly difficult. Customers are having, difficulties paying. So we're having some training, professional training for our staff to manage challenging phone calls, to make that customer experience better, and also to support our staff. So there's some of the key improvements that we've been implementing. Do you have any questions on those?
Chris.
Thank you, Chair. If you'll recall, I have expressed concern in the past about the situation so far as adult social care accounting is concerned and the way in which communication took place with either the individuals concerned or their carers. And I'm pleased with the approach which is being taken, and I look forward to significant improvement. I'm probably not the only member who has been approached by members of the public who have been concerned and been, in some cases, completely bemused by their interaction with the council. And I agree that the first part of addressing this is, as was described, the customer journey. And my suggestion to officers to consider is to send an email to all councillors to say, if you have individuals who have experienced difficulty in dealing with adult social care on the invoicing side over the last 12 months, and if they would like to communicate with the relevant officers concerned, that the officers would be very interested to hear what they had to say and what the problems were that they experienced. Because with all due respect, it's very easy for us to look at something from a top-down point of view. This has to be looked at from a bottom-up point of view. And the more real experience that we get to hear about, the better we'll be able to change the system so that they'll be better. Thank you, Chair.
I think that's a good idea. And Philippa, you have quite a lot of connections with this sort of thing as well.
Thank you, Councillor Bowden. And at least to have an appropriate email, might be a generic one, but just so we know who we could share something like that with, because we're obviously not in a position to really deal with it in detail. Thank you.
The County Council comms people do periodically remind us of how we can help people who are having difficulty paying their bills, and not just county council bills, but other food bills and electricity bills and everything else. But it's really, it needs to go a bit further than that as well, doesn't it? And help with the services which the county council provides. Chris.
Yes, Chair. I wasn't talking about the difficulty that people have about paying their bills. I was talking about the difficulty they had in understanding the myriad of documents which sometimes came apparently inconsistently from CCC, which caused a lot of confusion to individuals knowing where they stood. Now, one of those problems was, of course, the failure to indicate the total amount which was due at any one time, which I appreciate is something which is already being dealt with. But it wasn't the only item. And especially in adult social care, it can be very difficult with a lot of recalculations which are done in any particular case. So hearing what the individuals at the sharp end have actually experienced and what they thought about it can be very valuable to us in making changes to make the whole experience a clearer one and a cleaner one for everyone concerned.
Okay, good idea. Are we happy with that, folks? Lots of nodding around the table. So I think, is that down to you, Alison, to address?
I'll take that forward. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So the recommendation is that, unless I missed something else that you're going to say, thank you for the improvement plan. I had read it and I noticed it and was very impressed by all the various activities which you've got, either you're doing or have already done. So the recommendation is to note the actions and approach being taken to manage income collection and debt recovery, which we have done. Thank you very much. Okay, so now we move on to item 7, which is the internal audit progress report. And Mairead, who unfortunately is not particularly well, is, I gather, joining us by Zoom. Are you there, Mairead? What do you think, Dawn?
I am, Chair. I'm hoping to get my video working. Is that working? It
is, yes. And we can see the halo around your head as well. Oh, I'm not going to pass that one. So, yes. Are you recovering? Are you getting better?
I am, thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm sorry not to be with you there today.
Oh, no matter. Right. Well, I think you've saved Tom a bit of angst by being here. But I'm sure we would have managed anyway, even if you hadn't. Would you like to introduce your report, and then we'll no doubt have questions for you?
Thank you very much, Chair. So this is our regular progress report to committee with an update on the work of internal audit since our last report in November. There are a couple of key things to note which I'll run through, and other than that, the report contains the normal sections. So happy to take any questions on the report at the end. Probably the key part of this report to bring to your attention is that section 6, where we set out the draft audit plan for 2023 to 2024. As you know, we operate a flexible audit plan, so we review and update this on a quarterly basis anyway. But in advance of the new financial year, we have done a more comprehensive refresh of our risk assessment for this report, and we've looked at our coverage of different categories of risk, which we've termed assurance blocks in your report. Just to make sure that the plan for the year going forward provides coverage of the various different types of risk that the council is exposed to. So the draft plan has been through CLT for comments, and it now comes to this committee for approval and any comments on the proposed coverage. I should also note, given the extent of organisational change at the moment, we are proposing to do another fairly significant review of the audit plan around April to May time. And that will give the opportunity for our new executive directors and the new monitoring officer to also input their thoughts to the plan. Excuse me. As usual, we have an update on the implementation of audit actions at section 7. And then I'll also bring your attention to the update on risk management at section 8. So with regards to risk management, this section includes an update on the January CLT risk and assurance meeting, including some updates to the corporate risk register. And we've brought you a copy of the corporate risk register as Annex C to this report. The most significant changes, which I would bring to the committee's attention, are the addition of a new risk number 12, which relates to the risk of climate change. That's discussed at section 8.5 of the report. And then additionally, the likelihood score for risk 3, which is that the council does not have enough budget to deliver agreed short and medium term corporate objectives, has been reduced from a score of 4 to a score of 3 to reflect the fact that a balanced budget has been proposed. So that risk has been downgraded. Those are the key areas of the report that I wish to highlight to committee, but very happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Mairead. Chris has got some questions. I'm going to just jump in first, if I may, to pick up one or two of the things which you talked about. I think it's eminently sensible that new directors should have an opportunity to review the audit plan, so doing that in the next few months as they arrive makes sense. When you say the corporate leadership team reviewed the plan, does that mean they were happy with the plan or they've made changes? So I'll leave Stephen to ask that question. Secondly, on the plan itself, I couldn't see anything directly relating to fixing of potholes, which is the topic which hits our inboxes most. I know it's related to the asset management strategy and some of the other things, but is there anything which we should be doing further on that? And the third thing relating to something you said about risk management, I know we've agreed a balanced budget for 1 year, but the budget risk is about short and medium term budgets. It's not just for 1 year at a time. And we still have an enormous, in quotes, black hole for subsequent years. Oh, Chris is shaking his head. No doubt we will find a way of balancing it, but I'm just always worried when we say, oh, well, we're reducing the risk on budgets, because that gives, to me, the wrong impression. So I'll start with those 3 questions, but I have got some others. Tom or Stephen.
Chair, I think I'll go first and then Tom will no doubt come in as well. On the audit plan itself, Mairead presented the draft plan to the corporate leadership team. It was discussed and the team had the opportunity to look at both the core and flexible elements of the plan. They also input to what was included, particularly in the flexible aspect of the plan prior to Mairead bringing the report forward. The team were satisfied with the plan as presented. post the corporate leadership team meeting and prior to Mairead submitting the report for committee's consideration, I made one minor adjustment on the flexible plan. I think Mairead had specified an audit around safe recruitment practice. I asked her to extend that to safe employment practice because it shouldn't just be around people joining the organisation, it should be about people in employment as well. So that was the one adjustment I made to the plan. On the broader points, Chair, around the risk score and the longer term financial position of the council, I know Tom will no doubt want to come in on this. I would just say it wouldn't be the way I'd characterise the financial position, Chair, to describe it as a black hole. The council has now approved a balanced budget for the next financial year, and as is the case with every other local authority with a medium-term financial strategy, we don't have a black hole. We have an understood gap that we need to achieve, whether through combination of income savings or indeed other changes. So I think I understand, Chair, why you might have chosen to use that language, but I would suggest that that's not quite my characterisation of it. Thank you.
That's fine, and it just was the phrase that popped into my head thinking about the gap that we've got to plug, but that's okay. The other comment I made was about potholes and whether or not there is something specific within the flexible plan that we should be earmarking some time to reviewing how we fix potholes, or whether we're comfortable that that's being dealt with by highways and transport. And I was thinking in particular about the link to the work that you're allocating to the asset management strategy, Mairead, but again, Stephen, I think is going to address that first.
Yeah, Chair, apologies. I should have answered that in the previous response, and Mairead might want to complement this because she's much more familiar with the depth of the plan than I am. The comment I would make is the issue, whether it's potholes or highways maintenance in the broader sense, we obviously have the established highways improvement programme, which is reported through and accountable to the Highways and Transport Committee. That would include these types of issues. It may well be Mairead wants to touch on whether or not the plan has any aspects around that. One of the key changes being undertaken this year is the implementation of the new highways asset management system, which may be something that the audit team want to look at if they haven't already built it in. I am slightly worried, Chair, now that I'm looking at the screen. I've got a horrible feeling we've either lost Mairead or she may have frozen. So I'm afraid I'm not going to be in a position to give you the depth of the answer on the audit plan, but I've given you a high-level answer to start with. Hopefully that's helpful, Chair. Thank you.
Thank you. Could somebody check whether Mairead is there? Oh, she's come back. How much of that did you catch, Mairead?
I'm so sorry. Laptop disaster. I'm afraid I caught absolutely none of that. Apologies, Chair.
It was a very good answer by the chief executive, as you would expect, who completely put me in my place when I implied that there was, in quotes, a black hole in the budgets looking forward, that like other local authorities, there is a gap to be filled, which will be filled in subsequent years by income or whatever. So that's one element which was not covered, which was adequately covered. The one which I think is outstanding for you to cover, if you are able, is: are you planning any work on looking into fixing of potholes, or is that something which you will you'll keep a vague eye on, but there is already adequate work going on by others in the council, and that at this stage your audit team don't need to do any more work?
So we do have some minimal coverage of the pothole scheme as part of the core plan rather than the flexible plan. Excuse me. So in your report at 6.5.2, if you scroll down to the section on grant certification work, we do sign off the pothole and challenge fund, which is a specific pot of money that is allocated to potholes each year, and also the local transport capital block funding, of which sometimes gets spent on potholes. So we do have some coverage of pothole review, but I would say in general, given the limited resource that we have as internal audit, potholes generally haven't been high enough in our risk assessment to merit there being further time spent on them beyond the work that we do on certifying those government grants.
Just to clarify, I've now found on page 302 an audit on the pothole and challenge fund for which covers 5 days and is the annual cycle of grant certification requirement. So nothing about how we're doing potholes or fixing them or not.
So the focus of the grant work that we do is around providing assurance to central government that we've used the grant within the terms and conditions that are set for us by central government. So that includes some sample testing to make sure that where we say we've fixed a pothole, we have fixed a pothole, as well as looking at the systems, the wider systems in place that control sort of how we identify potholes for repair and raise works on the system, and how we then certify that they're complete and should be paid as such. So there is some review of that system, but I would say, you know, with a 5-day review to sign off a grant, it's not a detailed review of the way of the entire system sort of from end to end. It's just providing verification that that money is being spent as it should be.
Okay, thank you. Let's see what others have to say, and then maybe we'll come back to that. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. 2 things. The first is a very simple one. In Annex B, which is the schedule of outstanding recommendations, it's something which I've mentioned before. I'd be very grateful when we're talking about risk matters such as this and outstanding recommendations, if they could be ordered. So the ones which have got a high seriousness come first, and then the medium ones come later. It just makes it easier to prioritise what needs to be prioritised. I don't think it's necessary to address any of those. All the answers are given within the report. My greater concern was in Annex C, where we were provided with the summary of the risk profile for the council as a whole. And I'm very grateful that we've been provided with this. And it has all the indications of having been re-examined quite robustly. Having said that, it is one of the more worrying reports that I've seen for any local authority in terms of direction of travel. And I'd actually like to go through this, if I may, Chair, because I think that some of the points within it are ones which we really need, if not to get assurance now, to be in a position to get better assurance in the future. The first 2 items are the council's arrangements for safeguarding vulnerable adults and also for safeguarding vulnerable children and young people. Now, the way in which the basic assessment works, and it's a very good rough and ready way of doing it, is that for each risk, we see the likelihood listed from 1 to 5, the severity or consequence listed from 1 to 5. The 2 numbers are multiplied together. If it's 16 or more, it's in the red, therefore serious. If it's 15 or less, it's amber or even green. It's a very rough and ready approach, but it's highly effective in giving us a very easy visualization of where we are. But it's got its limitations. And one of those limitations is granularity in the more extreme cases. And on those first 2 risks, that is vulnerable children and young people and vulnerable adults, I am concerned that we are at that 15 place, right beneath where it goes into the red, and that we're not seeing any prospect of an improvement. The target is no different from the existing position. And I'd be interested there in us getting some assurance at a lower level, because the figures we see in front of us don't just come out of the blue. They are the results of a much, much bigger risk assurance process which goes through the organisation, and we see only the tip of the iceberg here. I think I'd like to see a little bit further down in the iceberg, because there are items such as, for example, potential serious harm or death for a young person or for a vulnerable adult. And I'd like to know in that particular case, what is deemed to be the likelihood and what actions are being taken in terms of that to try to reduce the overall risk. Because it's the sort of area where I'm sorry to say we've seen in other local authorities, we've seen some terrible cases over the years, and I never ever want Cambridgeshire to be added to that list. So whilst that is hidden within the overall numbers that we see here, it's that sort of granularity which, when we see a number 15 being shown overall for the risk, I'd really be interested to see more detail on something like that. But then when we go to the other risks, I was really surprised by this. And I'm not criticising the process. I think the process probably has been done really honestly. But we're seeing a reflection of something which is serious. Go to risk 3, not having enough budget to deliver agreed short and medium-term corporate objectives. We currently have a score of 12 on that, and our target, so-called target, is 15. Now, of course, that's not a target in that sense, it's a projection about where we're going to be. But it's ever so worrying that we have an increase in the likely perceived risk rather than a maintenance or a decrease. And I can understand why that's been put in there in that particular case, but when I went through item by item, we saw all too frequently this similar increase. A serious incident occurs. This is risk 4, preventing services from operating and requiring a major critical incidents response. Again, the overall risk gone up from 12 to 15, which is of concern. The council doesn't deliver its statutory or legislative obligations. Again, gone up this time from 10 to 15 because of a greater likelihood than we had before, rather than more consequence. And number 7, I think, was the next one, which had an increase, which was insufficient infrastructure to deliver the council services. Again, up from 12 to a so-called target of 15. We had the same increase in number 8, failure to deliver key council services, up from 10 to 15 because of an increased likelihood. A very interesting change on the council being a victim of cybercrime, going from a likelihood of 5 and a consequence of 3 to a likelihood of 3 and a consequence of 5, which is extremely interesting. And I think I can understand some of that, but that's always going to be an area, of course, that we're going to be concerned about. You go to risk 10, our failure to comply with information governance legislation and industry standards. Again, risk going up from currently 12 to a so-called target, an expectation of 15. And finally, risk 11, the failure of key partnerships or contracts, again, gone up from 12 to 15. Now, these targets aren't what we're aiming for, of course. These targets are a reflection of what we perceive to be the difficulties that we're going to be potentially facing in the future. But it's a very, very worrying a picture which is being shown to us. And I think that I think it's worthwhile, with all due respect for the Chief Executive, just to comment on the fact that it is worrying and it's something we should be worried about. And it means that we need to give greater attention to all of these areas than might otherwise have been the case. This risk system it's a warning system for us as much as anything else, and we are being given a warning here. I know the items haven't gone into the red yet, but in all the cases I've just mentioned, they are 1 point away up to number 15. They get to number 16 and they're in the red. So I think that this is a real warning shot for us, and we ought to recognise it as such, Chair. And I'd be really interested to hear what the Chief Exec has to say about that.
Thank you, Stephen. Do you want to tell us about the Service Directorate risk registers, which do a bit more of a deep dive? And naively, I was thinking the target score is not it's not a target at all. It's more like an acceptable score, but maybe that's misleading as well.
Chair, thank you. Start off with the methodology. So 15 from memory, and this is me just having to check my memory. A 15, as described in the scoring, is actually in line with the council's risk appetite, which has been approved. Anything above 16, therefore, needs to be treated urgently. So in some ways, Councillor Bowden is making the right point, but I think it's important to clarify what's within risk appetite as part of that presentation. It's not really a target, but of course, again, Councillor Bowden's absolutely right in his remarks. That's the terminology that's built into our risk software, which is why it's presented in the way it is. In the broadest sense possible, Chair, first of all, on all of these risks, as you would expect, I think Councillor Bowden used the phrase iceberg. I'll try and think of an appropriate metaphor that's not quite so disastrous. Pyramid is slightly better, certainly solid foundations. So yes, using the foundations analogy, there are detailed directorate risk registers that sit beneath all of these. So if I use the examples of risks 1 and 2, safeguarding of children and adults, there are detailed arrangements that sit around all of these. There are detailed mitigations and controls in place. Perhaps what we need to do in the next report, where this comes forward to audit and accounts, and of course the corporate risk register equally is scrutinised by Strategy and Resources Committee, we probably need to ensure you've got some more of the narrative that sits around this that perhaps isn't reflected in the scoring methodology. The scoring methodology remains important. In terms of the overall context on some of the scoring, I would just make the point that that is probably reflective of the corporate leadership's team collective view around the pressures, the strains that this authority, not uniquely this authority, but certainly our view about where this authority currently is. So yes, I think to describe that as an early warning sign is helpful and accurate. That's not to say that anything disastrous or calamitous is about to happen. It is to say that we are managing an increased level of risk across a number of areas in this authority, like every other one in the country. More broadly, it's also reflective of the fact that we are actually now treating risk dare I say, in a much more serious and considered way on an ongoing basis as a leadership team. So as Mairead's highlighted in the covering report, we now meet and explore the risks quarterly in much greater depth than has happened. In fact, Mairead might forgive me for saying this, but I think prior to my arrival just a year ago, the risk register was not something that frequently appeared at the corporate leadership team. So that's why I've changed those arrangements and enhanced them. A number of the risks that are presented in the report today in the appendix, we are also restructuring because some of them are actually unhelpful aggregations of things. So for example, the one around strategic partnerships and contracts, there's work currently being undertaken now to separate that out, because clearly partnerships risk is slightly different to contractual and commercial risk. So Sue Grace, our Executive Director of Strategy and Partnerships, is currently separating those. We've equally adjusted some of the risk owners as part of the refresh of the corporate risk register, which will give a bit more focus and attention than perhaps we've had in the past. So Chair, I guess in summary, what I'm saying is I recognise the comments Councillor Bowden is making. I just reflect that 15 or below is within risk appetite for the Council. But if you look at the overall increase in either probability or impact that we're highlighting, that is a reflection on an increased level of risk threshold that we're having to live within as an authority. And I would say again, Chair, that that is probably no different to any other local authority at this point in time, particularly one with upper tier safeguarding responsibilities like a county council. Thank you.
Thank you,
Stephen. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm very grateful for the Chief Executive's comments, which I fully agree with. I did make a point about granularity, however, and I did say how this is it's a pretty rough and ready scoring system, but it's a very valuable one. However, it does lack granularity. And when we talk about 5 as a consequence, there are 5s and there are 5s. And when we talk about the potential death of a vulnerable child or young person, or the potential death of a vulnerable adult, that, if I can put it this way, is a much more serious 5 than some other 5s are. And it was in that area in particular, when I saw the overall score of 15, something like that, I'd really like to see the granularity there, where we can see what's the expected likelihood of that, and much more important than the score, what actions are being taken in order to try and reduce the risks of those particularly problematic areas where we can't score more than 5 in terms of the consequence, but if we could, we would.
Chair, a very brief comment. Thank you to Councillor Bowden for those remarks. I wholeheartedly agree. A risk to life and limb is obviously much more serious in terms of our role, or indeed the things we should be mitigating, dare I say, than an immediate risk to IT system sustainability, not from a cybercrime perspective, but just in terms of normal business continuity. So I would always suggest that there is a degree of a weighting potentially around the severity of the 5, if you like. So that's something we can look at further. That's certainly something I've seen reflected in other risk registers and risk scoring methodology. So I think that's a helpful observation. I'm due to meet with Mairead and Neil Hunter, our head of best value and diligence, to actually look through some of this, and particularly risk 8, which I think I'm now going to be ending up owning directly, because it's a global risk around service delivery rather than one that individual executive directors can own. So I'm happy to pick that up with them when I meet with them. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Any other comments from anybody on any other aspects of Mairead's report? Mairead, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Nothing further from me, Chair.
No. Okay, thank you very much. So we've reviewed Mairead's report and commented on and approve the proposed internal audit plan for 2023-24 as outlined in section 6 of the report. Okay, thank you very much. Move on to item 8, which is the Audit and Accounts Committee Terms of Reference Review. Can I ask Mairead to present this item, please?
Thank you, Chair. So at the previous meeting of this committee, it was agreed to undertake a review of the committee's terms of reference, and this paper brings the results of that review for the committee's comments and endorsement. So the terms of reference has been reviewed in light of the recently updated SIPFA position statement on audit committees in local authorities and police, and there's a copy of this guidance attached at Annex C to this report. So we have proposed some changes to the terms of reference, Primarily, that's to bring the language more closely in line with the SIPFA position statement, and also particularly to propose that the committee is given the power to approve changes to the authority's anti-fraud and corruption policy and the anti-money laundering policy. So that would bring the committee's powers in line with its ability to approve the whistleblowing policy. We're requesting that the committee comment on, suggest any changes to, and endorse the updated terms of reference, which will then need to go on to Constitution and Ethics Committee initially, and then to full council for final approval. This report also includes a proposal for the committee to undertake a self-assessment of its effectiveness, which was also agreed at the previous meeting. And so the proposal for that is set out at section 4.2. The first step suggested is for the committee to form a working party alongside myself as the head of internal audit to complete some SIPFA recommended tools for a review of the committee's effectiveness. We would also be inviting the Chief Executive Monitoring Officer and Chief Financial Officer to contribute to that assessment. So I would suggest that that takes place once the new monitoring officer is in post. So we're also requesting as part of this report that the committee agree the proposals for the self-review of effectiveness or suggest an alternative approach if that's desired. Thank you.
Thank you, Mairead. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. I was concerned when I saw this agenda item and opened Annex A, the marked changes, with some trepidation, fearing what I would see. And I think apart from one or two cases where we talked about where we have just changes in terminology, that every other change which is being proposed strengthens the power of this committee and means that we will have greater scrutiny rather than less scrutiny. So I'm more than pleased with what I see in front of us here. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Just on the terms of reference, I may have missed it and I've been missing various things today, but Mairead, does it talk specifically about reporting back to full council on various things at different times in the year? And if so, where is that? Because under audit activity, it doesn't specifically say, and I don't know whether it should say, about going back to council.
Chair, I can confirm it is in there somewhere. Where exactly, you'll have to bear with me for a moment. Apologies.
It may be paragraph 2.8, Chair.
Yes, thank you.
What page is that, Chris? Page 377. 377. Beg your pardon. Right, to report as appropriate to full council. So as appropriate. So it doesn't specifically say when we've got to do it. Relevant policy and service committees, which we haven't tended to do in the past, but we can do that. And the Constitution and Ethics Committee, which we have done on issues which require their attention or further action. So we could report to relevant policy and service committees on the risk register, for instance. We could express our concerns about some of those, but maybe that's something which strategy and resources counts as a policy and service committee, doesn't it? So that would work for that. Okay, right. So if we can just deal with the terms of reference first, I think you're looking quizzical, Philippa.
No, I'm just learning so much, and I'm trying to digest how this affects me as a division councillor, a member of other committees, and a member now of this committee. And I'm starting to see some light here, because I think if I'm responding to an intelligent query from a resident saying, how can we get more resources into X, I would know I can go back to things like a risk register and not just the whim of policy. You actually are addressing a risk. It takes longer, of course, but if we're saying gritting, what are the risks we are adjusting, that's probably not as important as some of the ones under risk 2, which trouble me and I might want to pursue out of this meeting. But thank you.
All right, so are we comfortable that the amended terms of reference make sense? And we have previously agreed, and it's in here, that we could have external appointees, and we agreed at the last full council meeting what remuneration they would get, what allowance they would get. But before we select or go out to advert and select them, it does make sense to review our effectiveness as a committee. And therefore, are you comfortable that we should review that as set out in section 4 of Mairead's report with a small working party, and then invite the monitoring officer and Stephen and Tom, and I would suggest Mark from EY or whoever else might wish to have a view about how we get on and what we should be doing differently or better. Chris.
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I think that approach is entirely appropriate. And I'll say, I think I've said it before. If I haven't said it before in this Audit and Accounts Committee, I've said it in others. When we have the prospect of external members, it's really important that we consider what added value they can bring. And added value tends to come from having a different perspective. So we don't, if we had 2 external members, for example, we wouldn't want 2 who are very similar in terms of their background, knowledge and experience. We do need to look at transferable skills that individuals will have, where they're able to look at the problems we have in front of us from a different perspective with a different pair of eyes and come up with some novel and interesting questions that we wouldn't come up with. So looking for that added value is much better than having 2 members coming along who will not give that added value, who will just reflect accepted wisdom. We want a constructive challenge here from a different and educated perspective.
Indeed, we do. When does the new monitoring director, who's going to be responsible for, or we're going to be responsible to her, or she's going to be responsible to us, start?
Emma Duncan, our new Service Director of Legal and Governance and Monitoring Officer, starts on the 27th of March.
Okay, I think we can probably start some of this in the background, can't we? And Mark will be aware in the Combined Authority Audit and Governance Group, individual members of the committee were invited to fill in a questionnaire about what skills and experience and such like they had. And I would suggest that that's something which we could do as individual members, just to help Mairead start this process, as well as inviting comments from others. Stephen.
Chair, well, 1, I would support those comments, and 2, whilst it will be really helpful to have Emma contribute to that as our substantive monitoring officer, just to remind members, of course, we do have an interim and very experienced monitoring officer working with us in the shape of Linda Walker, so I'm sure Linda would be able to contribute and may have some observations to make, even in the timeline between now and Emma taking up the substantive role. Thank you.
Right, any other comments, questions? Anything else, Mairead, you want to say on that? No. Okay, thank you very much. So we have reviewed and endorsed the updated terms of reference, which will now need to go to Constitution and Ethics and full council, and we've agreed the proposals for the committee effectiveness as set out in section 4. Thank you. Item 9 is the committee agenda plan. Is there anything to update us on that, Dawn?
Nothing from me, Chair.
Anything from anybody else? No. Well, I think that means that we have noted the agenda plan, and that concludes our meeting. The next committee is on the 26th of May at 2 p.m. And I'd like to thank everyone for attending and those members of the public for watching on YouTube. Thank you, everybody. Goodbye.